Trump made the problem worse, but more important, he let the world know that there is no hope of America ever, getting a handle on this debt because neither party wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so the only choice is to get out. That's why the world has been buying gold. That's why central banks are buying gold. They want out of the dollar. And that's why China is looking to give the world an alternative. What China should do is what we did initially, is back the RMB with gold. They should say that the RMB is better than the dollar because the dollar is backed by nothing and our currency is backed by gold.
The escalation of U.S. national debt has sent a clear signal to the global economy. Washington lacks the political will to solve its fiscal crisis. With neither party willing to address the deficit, the world is increasingly viewing the dollar as a trap, prompting central banks to accumulate gold as a necessary escape valve aggressively. This flight from the greenback signals that the world is looking for an exit from the U.S. financial system. PeterSchiff, chief global strategist at Euro-Pacific Capital, argues that this lack of fiscal discipline has given rival nations a strategic advantage. He contends that China should seize this moment to back the RMB with gold, offering a superior alternative to the unbacked dollar. By validating its currency with tangible assets, while the U.S. dilutes its own with debt, China could expose the fiat dollar's inherent weakness and force a global return to sound money principles. Now, we present the clips from PeterSchiff's interview. Before we continue to discuss this, please subscribe to our channel and activate the bell icon for timely updates.
Plenty of reasons to do it in the past, but Biden and now Trump have given it even more reason. And not just China. There are countries all around the world that really want to divest of dollars, not just because the dollar is, a flawed currency to hold, that we're going to keep printing dollars because of our massive debts. And so the holders of dollars are going to lose purchasing power the longer they hold them, but because of the political aspects. The ability of the United States to sanction whoever it wants by threatening to remove their access or take their reserves. And so, we've really pushed the world to a decision that they should have made on their own. But now it's happening. But most Americans do not understand the degree to which the dollar's reserve status is basically responsible for our entire standard of living. I mean, our economy, our consumer-based credit economy rests on a foundation of the dollar's reserve status. Without it, we couldn't have this economy. Now, in the long run, that would be a good thing. I mean, I think we have taken advantage and exploited the dollar's reserve status to live beyond our means and indulge ourselves. But ultimately, a day of reckoning was going to come. And the longer we built an economy dependent on the reserve status of the dollar, the harder it's going to be to transition back to reality when that exorbitant privilege is revoked. Because what the world has allowed Americans to do is spend a lot of money, consume a lot more than we produce, borrow a lot more than we save. So we're able to have $1 trillion a year trade deficits, multi-trillion-dollar budget deficits. The reason we have this huge military force is because the dollar's reserve status has financed it. And so if we lose this, then the dollar's going to collapse. Prices in America are going to go through the roof. Consumer prices, much worse than anything we saw, under Biden, just sky-high prices. Interest rates, long-term interest rates are going to soar. And the whole consumer economy is going to collapse. We're going to have an economy built for consumer spending, but with nothing for consumers to buy. The shelves are going to be empty because we don't make any of this stuff, and we won't be able to afford to import it after the dollar collapsed, claiming that America has all the cards because we buy everything, we consume everything. He's got it backwards. We don't have any of the cards. It's the producers that are in control. They make all the stuff. Consuming it is just the benefit that you get after you produce stuff. The Chinese and the rest of the world are perfectly capable of consuming what they produce without us. But we cannot consume what is not produced. So the Chinese win, the rest of the world wins, particularly the emerging market wins, and the U.S. loses because the ride on the global gravy train comes to an end. We have to live within our means. And unfortunately, decades of outsourcing our manufacturing and hollowing out our industry have left us in a situation where we can't, We're not self-sufficient anymore. The rest of the world is. Right? All they have to do is buy what they produce, and that will happen when the dollar crashes. Because when the dollar crashes, what that does is that shifts purchasing power from America to the rest of the world. And so now products that were too expensive for the Chinese become a lot cheaper, and now they buy them. And products that were cheap in America now become very expensive, and so we don't buy them because we can't afford them anymore. Trump has made it worse, not only with threats to invade Greenland, which he's walked back, but also more threats of sanctions. But also, I think what made a big difference was when Trump ran for election this time, there was a lot of talk about getting our fiscal house in order. Elon Musk was going to come to Washington with Doge, and we were going to cut trillions of dollars out of the federal budget, and we were going to get a handle on the runaway debt. So there was some optimism that maybe, this would happen. Now, I never believed that. I was telling my clients and my audience that it was all BS. And of course, I was right, because they ran Elon Musk out of town. So very little was cut. But what did happen was the big, beautiful bill, which increased government spending, reduced taxes, and widened the deficits that were inherited from Biden. So Trump made the problem worse, but more important, he let the world know that there is no hope of America ever, getting a handle on this debt, because neither party wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so the only choice is to get out. That's why the world has been buying gold. That's why central banks are buying gold. They want out of the dollar. And that's why China is looking to give the world an alternative. What China should do is what we did initially, is back the RMB with gold. They should say that the RMB is better than the dollar because the dollar is backed by nothing and our currency is backed by gold. And they should do that and make it convertible. And then what they should do is they should sever the tie between the Hong Kong dollar and the US dollar. And they should peg the Hong Kong dollar to the RMB and peg the RMB to gold. I mean, that's checkmate. The game is over. And, China has all the production. They've got all the factories. They've got all the exports. They've got the savings. They can have the reserve currency. Now, maybe they won't get the whole world, right? Maybe some countries will still hang on to the dollar for a while, but they will eat into our monopoly substantially. And that is going to be a huge problem for the United States. No, I don't trust the Chinese government. I don't trust any government.
Yeah.
But the facts speak for themselves if you just look at, the situation. And most countries that trade with China have more balanced trade. All of these countries have surpluses with the United States. So China makes stuff that all these countries need. We don't, right? We just ask them to hold our IOUs and watch them depreciate. So I think trade with China is more important than trade with the United States. And so it's in the self-interest of the world. I mean, look at Canada now. We've actually driven Canada closer to China than they've ever been.
Yes.
Which I think benefits Canada. I mean, it would be easier to trade with the United States because we're right here. But the fact of the matter is that, China makes a lot of things that the Canadians need. And Canada, they make a lot of stuff that we need. And so it makes sense for those nations to trade more with one another. And, to the extent that Canada can wean itself off the U.S., that's Canada's gain and it's our loss. Same thing with Mexico. Same thing with South America. They're building all these big ports down there so that they no longer have to ship stuff in and out of Long Beach or San Pedro. Because right now, a lot of Chinese merchandise arrives in the U.S. and then gets transferred on smaller ships. But they're building these large, deep water ports now to bypass the United States. So we're totally cut out. The world is already reducing its reliance on the dollar. Gold is now the largest reserve held by central banks, more so than treasuries. So the pendulum is already moving in that direction. Maybe China wants to just give it a nudge so it moves faster, and that may be happening.
The United States is facing an economic day of reckoning as the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency crumbles. For decades, Americans have enjoyed a standard of living that exceeds their production capabilities, financed entirely by global demand for U.S. debt. However, the weaponization of sanctions and runaway fiscal deficits have forced the world to seek alternatives. Central banks are now aggressively accumulating gold to divest from the dollar, anticipating a future in which the greenback loses its purchasing power and U.S. consumer prices skyrocket. China is capitalizing on this vulnerability by establishing independent trade routes and potentially preparing a gold-backed RMB to challenge U.S. hegemony. With infrastructure projects like deep-water ports in Latin America actively bypassing American logistics, the global supply chain is decoupling from its reliance on the U.S. As the global gravy train ends, the U.S. faces a future of soaring interest rates, empty shelves, and a collapsed consumer economy, while producing nations regain control of global wealth. Let's get back to the interview.
The bigger problem is that's the tip of the debt iceberg. What we don't focus on are the unfunded liabilities. So Americans are expecting Social Security checks. People who work for the government are expecting pensions. The government has guaranteed, a lot of pensions, bank accounts, student loans, right? The government is on the hook for hundreds of trillions. And so these are actual liabilities that if the government were a private company, it would have to recognize them and have reserves, a contingency plan.
Right.
But the U.S. government just assumes that none of those contingent liabilities exist. So we are in debt to a much greater degree than anybody believes, right? Because the people who are waiting for Social Security, they think they're owed that money, right? But the government doesn't have, the trust funds don't have the money. So it's a liability to the people, but it's not part of the national debt. The national debt just covers outstanding U.S. treasuries. That's it. It doesn't cover any of the mortgage-backed securities that the U.S. government guarantees, right? Why aren't they included? Right? So it's a lie to say we only have 39 trillion in debt. We have much more than that. We don't have enough gold, assuming we actually have the gold that we're supposed to have. We don't have enough. I mean, maybe, 40,000. I don't know where gold would have to be for it to be adequate. But it's not going to happen. We're not going to be able to repay the debt. We're going to either default on it or we're going to inflate it away. That's what gold is telling you. And Jerome Powell may deny that gold's move represents a loss of confidence in the Fed and the dollar, but that's exactly what it represents. It's not an accident that this is happening when you have Fed independence in jeopardy. Not that it was ever really independent, but at least there was a pretense. And now they're trying to drop the pretense completely and allow the president to control the Fed. And so, yes, people don't want dollars and they're moving to gold. In fact, I think the recent sharp decline in gold, I think that was orchestrated by the White House. I think that they were scared of what was happening. And so they coordinated this, this short selling raid to coincide with a false narrative, that is perpetuated by the media, based probably off of talking points fed to them by the Trump administration, that Walsh is some kind of unexpected pick that is an inflation hawk that is going to be tougher than Powell, less likely to cut rates, in fact, may even come in hot and raise rates right away and clamp down on money supply. I don't believe any of this, because there's no way Trump spent the last year criticizing Powell for being too late to cut rates. And now he's going to nominate somebody that, in his opinion, would be way worse than Powell because he would be even tighter than Powell. Look, I think maybe Scott Bassett or, Lutnick or somebody got to the president and said, Donald, we got a real problem here. Gold and silver are screaming. The dollar's at a 4-year low. It's at a record low against the Swiss franc. Yields are rising. You need to put out this fire now. We need to do something about it. And I think that's what they did. Now, the question is, how much time did they buy by, floating, this BS balloon and taking some of the wind out of the precious metal sails? I think what's going to happen, too, is this is my guess. I don't have any proof. But I think what's going to happen is when Walsh gets in there and then ends up doing exactly what Trump wants and starts cutting rates, they're going to be able to say, well, we had nothing to do with it. He's an independent guy. He's a hawk. And if he's cutting rates, well, it must really be justified. It's obviously not political because, we appointed this independent inflation hawk. Right. So you can trust and it's all bullshit. It's all part of the script. There is no, and the midterms are coming up this year. There's just no way that he's going to put somebody at the Fed that's going to completely obliterate the economy before the midterms to make sure that the Democrats get the House so that the first thing they do is impeach him. So, I mean, Trump's main goal is to maintain the House by the Republicans. And so he's just not going to do this. He wants rate cuts. He wants more stimulus. And so he's not going to put a guy at the Fed who's going to be an obstacle to that.
The official national debt figure of $39 trillion is merely the tip of a financial iceberg, obscuring a much darker reality of unfunded liabilities. Gold's persistence is the market's recognition of this insolvency, signaling that the only path forward is either default or massive inflationary devaluation. Recent market movements suggest a coordinated effort to manage this narrative, specifically regarding the nomination of a supposed inflation hawk to the Federal Reserve. Analysis indicates this is likely a political smokescreen designed to temporarily quell bond market panic while paving the way for the rate cuts and stimulus required to secure the upcoming midterms. The administration cannot afford a true hawk who would crush the economy. Thus, the tough-on-inflation stance is viewed as a calculated deception to buy time before the inevitable return to loose monetary policy. Share your thoughts on his analysis in the comment section below. If you find this video informative, please support us by turning on notifications to stay informed about our latest videos. See you in the following video. Thanks for watching.